Caleb Rowan heard the splashing before he saw the body. Not the gentle lapping of river water against stones, but the violent thrashing of something, or someone, fighting to stay alive. He dropped the fence post he'd been repairing and ran toward the sound, his boots pounding against the frozen ground. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman. Massive. Tall as any man he'd ever known. Maybe taller. And she was drowning. But here's what made his blood run cold. The bruises covering every inch of her exposed skin told him this wasn't an accident. Someone had done this to her. Someone had beaten her within an inch of her life and thrown her into that freezing water to finish the job. The question burning in Caleb's mind as he dove into that icy river wasn't just who would do this. It was why. He hit the water like he'd been stabbed with 1,000 knives. The cold wasn't just cold. It was pain. Pure, searing pain that made every nerve in his body scream for him to get out. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because that woman was going under, her head dipping below the surface, her massive arms too exhausted to fight anymore. Caleb grabbed her, and the weight nearly pulled him straight to the bottom. She wasn't just tall, she was solid muscle, heavy as a horse, and completely limp in his arms. Every stroke toward shore felt impossible. His old knee, the one that never quite healed right after that fall 5 years back, burned with agony. The current fought him like it had a personal grudge. And the woman kept slipping from his grip, her body so cold it felt like holding on to ice itself. But Caleb Rowan was nothing if not stubborn. He'd survived a war, buried a wife and child, and lived alone for 7 years on land that tried to kill him every winter. He wasn't about to let this river win. When he finally dragged her onto the muddy bank, she wasn't breathing right. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, broken gasps. Her lips had turned a deep, terrifying blue, and the marks on her body. God, the marks. Purple bruises that looked like boot prints. Deep cuts that could only come from a whip or a blade. And around her wrists, raw, bloody grooves where rope had been tied so tight it had cut through skin. Caleb had seen men tortured during the war. This was worse. "What did they do to you?" he whispered, but she didn't answer. Her eyes rolled back, her body went limp, and for a terrifying moment, Caleb thought he'd pulled a corpse from that river. Then she gasped, one desperate, rattling breath, and passed out cold in his arms. Caleb didn't hesitate. He lifted her, grunting under the weight, and carried her toward his cabin. What he didn't know was that saving her life would put a target on his own back, and the people coming for her wouldn't ask nicely. The cabin was barely warmer than outside when Caleb kicked the door open. The fire had died down to embers, and frost had started forming on the inside of the windows. He laid the woman down on his bed, the only bed, and went straight for the fireplace. His hands shook as he built up the flames, not from the cold, but from something else. Anger. Pure, seething anger at whoever had done this. You don't throw a woman in a river to drown unless you want her dead. This wasn't punishment. This was execution. As the fire grew, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls, Caleb got his first real look at her. She was Apache. That much was clear from her features, her long black hair, and the traditional leather clothing she wore, or what was left of it. Someone had torn it half off her body, but what struck him most was her size. Even unconscious, even broken and bleeding, she looked powerful. Her shoulders were broader than his. Her arms were thick with muscle. This was a woman built for survival, for fighting, for enduring things that would break lesser people. And yet someone had nearly killed her. He worked through the night cleaning her wounds. Some were so deep, he had to stop himself from being sick. The marks told a story of systematic brutality. She'd been whipped, beaten with something heavy, maybe a club, cut in places that would maximize pain. And those rope marks on her wrists? They hadn't just tied her up, they'd bound her so tight the rope had sawed through flesh down to bone. This wasn't the work of one person. This was a group, maybe a dozen people, all taking turns. Dawn was breaking when her eyes finally opened, and the first thing she did was try to kill him. Her hand shot out, grabbed his throat, and squeezed with strength that made his vision blur. Her eyes were wild, panicked, the eyes of someone who'd been betrayed so completely that trust was impossible. Caleb didn't fight back. He just held still, let her see his face, let her realize where she was. After what felt like an eternity, her grip loosened. She blinked, looked around. And then the panic in her eyes turned to something worse, recognition. She knew what had happened to her, and she knew she'd survived. "You're safe," Caleb rasped, rubbing his throat. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." She stared at him for a long moment, her chest heaving, her eyes searching his face for any sign of a lie. Then she spoke, her voice so rough it barely sounded human. "They will come for me." Those 4 words changed everything. Because Caleb realized this wasn't over. Whoever had tried to kill her hadn't just given up. They'd thrown her in that river expecting the water to do their dirty work. But she'd survived. And now they'd want to finish what they started. Caleb looked at this broken, brutalized woman and made a decision that would either save them both or get them killed. "Let them come," he said quietly. "I'll be waiting." But he wasn't ready for what she told him next. The woman, her name was Miella, she finally said, had been thrown in that river by her own tribe, not by enemies, not by raiders or settlers, by her own people, the ones who were supposed to protect her. And the reason? Because she'd said no. She'd refused to marry the man they'd chosen for her, a warrior she'd never loved, a man twice her age who'd wanted her for one reason only: to breed. The tribe had wanted strong children, and Miella, with her size and strength, was considered perfect breeding stock. When she refused, when she dared to say she wanted to choose her own path, they'd made an example of her. The chief's son had led the beating. They'd tied her to a post in the center of camp and taken turns with whips made of rawhide. Men she'd known her whole life, women who'd once called her friend, they'd beaten her for hours, and when she still wouldn't agree, when she still refused to submit, they'd made a final decision. They'd tied her wrists, thrown her in the river, and watched her sink. They'd told themselves it was justice, but it was murder, plain and simple. Caleb listened to all this with his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. He'd seen cruelty in the war. He'd seen men do terrible things to each other. But this was different. This was calculated. This was a community deciding that one woman's choice was worth less than their traditions, and they'd tried to erase her for it. "They wanted me to bear children for a man I didn't choose," Miella said, staring into the fire. "Because I'm big, because I'm strong, because they thought that's all I was good for." She looked at Caleb then, and in her eyes he saw something that broke his heart. The question of whether he saw her the same way. "No one," Caleb said, and his voice had the weight of iron in it, "gets to tell you what you're worth. Not here, not ever." And for the first time since she'd opened her eyes, Miella's shoulders relaxed, just a little, just enough to let Caleb know that maybe, just maybe, she believed him. But what neither of them knew was that 7 riders had already left the Apache camp, and they were heading straight for Caleb's ranch with orders to bring Miella back, dead or alive. The days that followed were strange. Caleb wasn't used to having anyone in his cabin, let alone a woman who took up half the space just by standing. Miella recovered quickly, faster than any person Caleb had ever seen. Within 3 days, she was walking. Within a week, she was helping with chores, despite his protests. She moved through the cabin like a force of nature, rearranging things, fixing things Caleb hadn't even noticed were broken. His shirts didn't fit her, so she wore them anyway, buttons straining across her chest, sleeves ending halfway down her powerful forearms. It should have looked ridiculous. Instead, it looked right. She was up before dawn every morning, tending the fire, preparing simple meals, organizing supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd spent their life working. But Caleb noticed something else too. The way she'd freeze sometimes, staring out the window toward the east, toward where her tribe's territory began. The way her hand would unconsciously move to her wrists, rubbing the healing scars. The way she'd wake in the night gasping, fighting invisible attackers. She was healing on the outside. Inside was a different story. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Miella finally asked the question Caleb had been dreading. "Why are you helping me?" She didn't look at him when she said it, just kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. And if they find me here, they'll kill you too. So why?" Caleb thought about that for a long moment. He thought about his wife, dead 7 years now from fever, his daughter, who'd barely lived a month before following her mother into the ground. The empty years since then, working this land alone, talking to no one, feeling nothing. And he thought about how, for the first time in 7 years, his cabin didn't feel like a tomb. "Because," he said slowly, "I spent 7 years waiting to die. And you spent your whole life waiting to live. Seemed like we both needed something to change." Miella turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Caleb saw tears forming in those dark eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Caleb shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. They're coming. Both of us know it. And when they do, we're going to find out if one man and one woman can stand against a whole tribe." But Miella smiled then, a fierce, dangerous smile. They've never fought a woman who had something to fight for before. That night, something changed between them. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the slow, inevitable pull of two lonely people finding warmth in each other. They sat by the fire, Miella mending one of Caleb's torn shirts with surprising delicacy for such large hands, and Caleb cleaning his rifle, not because it needed cleaning, but because it gave him something to do besides stare at her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words weren't always necessary, that sometimes just being near someone was enough. But then Miella set down her sewing and spoke, her voice so soft Caleb almost missed it. "I've never felt safe before. Not really. Even as a child, I always had to be stronger, tougher, harder than everyone else. Because if I wasn't, they'd see me as weak, as less than. And then when I got older, when I grew to this size, they started seeing me as something else, as property, as a tool." She looked at her hands, those massive, scarred hands that could probably snap a man's neck without effort. "But here, in this tiny cabin with you, I feel—" She trailed off, searching for the word. "Human," she finally said. "I feel human." Caleb set down the rifle. He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to respond to that kind of raw honesty. So he did the only thing that felt right. He moved closer to her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he said, "You've always been human. They just couldn't see it." And when Miella turned to him with tears streaming down her face, when she wrapped those powerful arms around him and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world made of water, Caleb held her back, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than emptiness. They didn't talk about what happened that night. They didn't need to. When morning came, they both understood that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just a man helping a stranger anymore. This wasn't just about survival. This was about two people who'd been broken by life, finding something worth protecting in each other. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Because that very afternoon, as Caleb was fixing the fence line and Miella was hanging laundry, they heard it. The sound that made Miella's blood run cold and Caleb's hand move instinctively toward his rifle. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming fast. Caleb counted 7 riders before they even crested the hill. All Apache, all armed, and leading them was a man whose face was painted with the red and black markings of a war chief. Mayella saw them and froze, the wet shirt in her hands falling to the ground. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the chief's son, the one who led the beating." Caleb looked at her, saw the terror in her eyes, and felt something dark and violent rise in his chest. "Get inside," he said quietly. "No," Mayella said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I'm done running. I'm done hiding. If they want to kill me, they'll have to do it looking me in the eye." The riders stopped 50 feet from the cabin, their horses pawing the ground nervously. The war chief, his name was Dakota, Mayella had told Caleb, dismounted slowly, deliberately, making a show of his authority. He was tall, muscular, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw that gave him a permanent sneer. He looked at Mayella with open contempt. "So," he said, in heavily accented English, "the dead woman lives. The river was too weak to hold you." He spat on the ground. "But we are not." Caleb stepped forward, putting himself between Dakota and Mayella. "She's not going anywhere," he said, and his voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who'd faced down death before and wasn't impressed. Dakota's eyes narrowed. "White man, this is not your business. She is property of the tribe. She defied our laws. She must return to face judgment." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "Judgment? Is that what you call throwing a woman in a river to drown? Where I come from, we call that murder." The other 6 riders shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Dakota took a step closer, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. She was given a choice: marry Chomani and live, refuse and die. She chose death. We merely carried out her choice. Caleb felt Mayella's hand on his shoulder, felt her trembling despite her brave words. "And what if I told you," Caleb said quietly, "that she's made a new choice? What if I told you she's chosen to stay here, with me?" That's when everything went sideways, because Dakota's hand moved toward his knife, and Caleb's hand moved toward his holstered revolver, and the 6 mounted warriors raised their rifles, and for one frozen moment, death hung in the air like smoke. But then Mayella did something no one expected. She stepped out from behind Caleb, planted her feet, and roared. Not a scream, not a shout, a roar. A sound so primal, so full of rage and defiance that even the horses reared back in fear. And in that moment, Caleb saw what the tribe had been so afraid of all along. Not a woman who was too big, but a woman who was too strong to control. "You want to kill me?" Mayella shouted, her voice carrying across the empty prairie. "Then do it now, right here. But know this, if you want me dead, you'll have to go through him first. And I promise you, Dakota, he's worth 10 of you." She pointed at the war chief, her finger steady as a gun barrel. "You couldn't break me with whips. You couldn't drown me in a river. What makes you think you can break me now?" The silence that followed was deafening. Dakota's face had gone pale, not from fear but from shock. No woman had ever spoken to him like that. No one had. And then Caleb played the only card he had left. "She's my wife," he said, loud enough for all the riders to hear. "By white man's law, and by the only law that matters, her choice. She's mine to protect. And I will." The lie came out so smooth, so natural, that even Mayella believed it for a moment. But it was the only way. Tribal law didn't apply to married women, especially women married to outsiders. If Mayella was Caleb's wife, legally, the tribe had no claim on her. Dakota knew it too. His hand fell away from his knife, but the war chief wasn't done yet. "You would marry this outcast?" Dakota's voice dripped with contempt. "She is damaged goods. She is cursed. She will bring you nothing but shame and sorrow. Caleb looked him dead in the eye. She brought me back to life. That's more than most men get. And with that, he reached for Miela's hand, that massive, scarred hand, and held it in front of all the riders. So you can take your judgment and your tribal law and ride back where you came from. She's not yours anymore. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Dakota did something unexpected. He smiled. You do not know what you are protecting, white man, but you will learn. When she turns on you, when her cursed blood brings disaster to your home, you will remember this day, and you will wish you had let us finish what we started. He turned to his horse, then paused and looked back at Miela. You are dead to us. Your name will be erased from the tribe. No one will speak of you. No one will remember you. You are nothing. Good, Miela said, her voice strong and clear. I never wanted to be remembered by cowards. And with that, the 7 riders turned and thundered away, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats. When they were finally out of sight, Miela's legs gave out. She collapsed onto her knees, her whole body shaking, and Caleb knelt beside her, holding her as she cried. Not from fear, not from relief, but from the overwhelming weight of finally being free. The weeks after the confrontation passed in a kind of careful peace. Caleb and Miela never talked about the lie he'd told, that she was his wife. They didn't need to. Some lies are truer than truths. She moved through the cabin like she'd always belonged there, cooking meals, mending clothes, fixing things Caleb had let fall apart over the years, and he found himself watching her sometimes, marveling at how someone so physically imposing could move with such gentleness, how someone who'd been treated like a tool could have so much tenderness. But there were signs that something deeper was happening. The way Miela's hand would linger on his shoulder when she passed him. The way Caleb would leave small gifts for her. Wildflowers he'd picked, a new leather strap for her hair, a blanket he'd traded for in town. Neither of them acknowledged these things out loud. It was safer that way. Safer to pretend this was just practical, just survival, just 2 people making the best of a bad situation. But late at night, when the fire burned low and shadows filled the cabin, they both knew the truth. This was becoming real. Then came the morning that changed everything again. Caleb woke to find Miela standing by the window, one hand pressed against her stomach, her face pale. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert. She turned to him, and in her eyes he saw something he'd never seen before. Terror. Not the terror of someone afraid of being hurt, but the terror of someone afraid of what they might be becoming. "I think," she started, then stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "I think I'm pregnant." The world tilted. Caleb sat up slowly, his mind racing. They'd shared one night together, just one, weeks ago. And now... He looked at Miela, saw her trembling, and understood that this wasn't just about a baby. This was about everything the tribe had wanted from her. Children, breeding, being used as a tool for the next generation. And now she was pregnant, but on her terms. By her choice. With a man she'd chosen. But that didn't make the fear any less real. "How do you know?" he asked quietly. "I know my body," Miela said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know. I can feel it. Something's different." She looked at him with those dark, frightened eyes. "Caleb, they wanted this. They wanted me to have children for them, and I refused. I let them beat me. I let them throw me in a river, because I wouldn't give them this." She pressed her hand harder against her stomach. "And now I'm giving it to you. What if I'm making the same mistake? What if I'm just trading one master for another?" The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He stood up, crossed the room in 3 strides, and took her face in his hands. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want you to give me anything. This isn't about what I want. This is about what you want. If you want this child, we'll raise it together. If you don't, we'll figure that out too. But you are not a tool. You are not property. And you sure as hell aren't trading one master for another, because I'm not your master. I'm just a man who got lucky enough to pull you out of that river. Miela searched his face for any sign of a lie, any hint of manipulation, but all she saw was honesty. Raw, painful honesty. And slowly, the fear in her eyes transformed into something else, something that looked almost like hope. I want this, she whispered. I want this baby. But I'm scared, Caleb. I'm so scared. He pulled her into his arms, felt her massive body press against his smaller one, and held her with everything he had. Then we'll be scared together, he said. But we'll get through it. I promise. But promises are fragile things, and the universe wasn't done testing them yet. Because that afternoon, when Caleb went into town for supplies, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The shopkeeper, old Tom Hendricks, mentioned in passing that there'd been Apache raids on 3 ranches to the east. Horses stolen, homes burned, one family dead. The territorial militia was forming, planning to ride out and retaliate. They're calling for any able-bodied man to join up, Tom said, wrapping Caleb's supplies. Figure you'll be volunteering, seeing as how you're out there alone and all. Caleb's stomach dropped. If the militia found out he was harboring an Apache woman, especially now with tensions this high, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd burn his ranch and hang them both. And if the Apache found out Miela was pregnant with a white man's child? Tribal law had provisions for that too. None of them good. Caleb realized with sickening clarity that they were caught between 2 fires. The whites would kill them for harboring an enemy. The Apache would kill them for betraying the tribe. And there was nowhere safe to run. He rode back to the ranch faster than he should have, the horse panting by the time he pulled up to the cabin. Miela was outside hanging laundry, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. What happened? She asked, dropping the shirt she was holding. Caleb dismounted, grabbed her arm, and pulled her inside. We need to talk, he said, and the grim tone of his voice told her this was bad, really bad. He told her everything, the raids, the militia forming, the fact that they were now living in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Miela listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each word. When he finished, she sat down heavily on the bed, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. So we can't stay here, she said. It wasn't a question. And we can't go east because that's militia territory. And we can't go west because that's tribal land. So where do we go? Caleb didn't have an answer. They sat in silence for a long time, both of them trying to figure out a solution to an impossible problem. Then Miela spoke, her voice so quiet Caleb almost missed it. What if we don't run? He looked at her sharply. What do you mean? She stood up, paced the small cabin, her massive frame casting long shadows on the walls. What if we stay? What if we make our stand here? You have land. You have supplies. You're a skilled shooter, and I... She paused, flexed her hands. I'm not helpless. If they come for us, either side, we fight. Against a militia? Caleb said incredulously. Against your whole tribe? Miela, that's suicide. She turned to him, and the look in her eyes was pure steel. I spent my whole life running from who I was. I ran from expectations. I ran from duty. And when I finally stopped running, when I finally stood up for myself, they threw me in a river. I'm done running, Caleb. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die standing in the home I chose, with the man I chose, protecting the child I chose to create. That's more than most people get. Caleb wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her it was crazy, that they needed to be smart, that you can't fight the world and win. But looking at her, this fierce, broken, beautiful woman who'd survived more than most people could imagine, he realized She was right. Running wouldn't save them. Hiding wouldn't save them. The only thing that might save them was standing their ground and hoping that the world was too busy killing itself to notice two people trying to live. "All right," he said finally. "We stay, but we prepare. If they're coming, we make sure they regret it." The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. Caleb reinforced the cabin walls, added shutters to the windows that could be barred from inside, and set up strategic positions where they could defend from multiple angles. He taught Myella to shoot, and discovered she was a natural, her steady hands and sharp eyes making her a better marksman than most men he'd known. They stockpiled ammunition, food, water. They mapped escape routes and backup plans. They turned the cabin into a fortress. And through it all, Myella's belly grew, just a little. Just enough that they both knew this was real. One night, as they sat by the fire cleaning weapons, Myella asked a question that had been haunting her. "If it comes down to choosing between me and the baby, what would you do?" Caleb stopped cleaning his rifle and looked at her. "What do you mean?" She met his eyes steadily. "If something happens, if we're attacked and you can only save one of us, who would you choose?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Caleb set down the rifle, walked over to her, and knelt in front of where she sat. "That's not a choice I'm ever going to make," he said firmly. "Because we're both getting through this. All three of us. But if you had to—" Caleb cut her off. "No, I don't deal in hypotheticals. I deal in what's real. And what's real is that you and that baby are the only good things in my life. So I'm not choosing, I'm fighting for both of you until my last breath. And if that's not good enough, then I guess we'll all go down together." Myella stared at him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but one filled with genuine warmth. "You're insane," she said. "Absolutely insane." Caleb grinned. "Had to be to jump in that river in the first place." But the laughter died when they heard the sound 3 nights later. Hoofbeats again. Multiple horses. But this time they were coming from the east, from militia territory. Caleb grabbed his rifle and peered through a gap in the shutters. 6 riders, all white men, all armed, and leading them was a man Caleb recognized, Sheriff Dalton from the nearest town. This wasn't a raid, this was an official visit, and that meant trouble. "Caleb Rowan!" Dalton's voice boomed across the prairie. "We need to talk!" Caleb looked back at Myella, who'd already positioned herself by the back window with another rifle. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "Let me handle this." She nodded, but he could see the tension in every line of her body. Caleb opened the front door just enough to be seen, keeping his rifle visible but not aimed. "Sheriff," he called out, "little late for a social call." Dalton dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol. "Not a social call, Caleb. We're here on business." "What kind of business?" Caleb kept his voice neutral, but his grip tightened on the rifle. Dalton looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be there but had no choice. "Word is you've got an Apache living with you. An Apache woman, that true?" The question hit like a hammer. Caleb's mind raced. Deny it, and they'd search the cabin, admit it, and... What? What would they do? "And if I do," he said carefully, "that's illegal now?" "Depends," Dalton said. "These are tense times, Caleb. Apache have been raiding. 3 families dead. We need to know whose side you're on." Caleb felt anger rising in his chest. "I'm not on any side. I'm on my side, and whoever lives on my property is my business." Dalton shook his head. "Not anymore, it ain't. Territorial governor declared martial law. Any non-white person on white-owned land needs to be registered. That means bringing her in for questioning." "Like hell," Caleb said, and his rifle came up just an inch. Not aimed at anyone, but the message was clear. The 6 riders behind Dalton shifted nervously, hands moving toward weapons. Dalton raised his hand, keeping things calm. Easy, Caleb. We don't want trouble. Just bring her out. Let us ask some questions, and we'll be on our way. Caleb laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what questioning means? She's not going anywhere. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Maella did something that changed everything. She opened the door wider and stepped out, her massive frame filling the doorway, her hand resting protectively on her barely visible baby bump. I'm the one you're looking for, she said, her voice carrying across the distance. I'm Apache. I'm pregnant with this man's child, and I'm not going anywhere. The militiamen stared, some with shock, some with disgust. One spat on the ground. Dalton's face went through several emotions: surprise, anger, and finally resignation. Caleb, he said quietly, you've really stepped in it now. You know what people will say? What they'll do? Caleb stepped beside Maella, his shoulder pressing against her arm. I know what good people will do. They'll mind their own damn business and let us live in peace. Dalton looked between them, this mismatched pair standing side by side, and something in his expression softened. I have to report this, he said, and when I do, there's going to be hell to pay. But, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I can be slow about filing that report, real slow. Give you time to figure things out. It was a gift, a dangerous gift that could cost Dalton his job, or worse. Caleb understood that. Why? He asked. Dalton mounted his horse, but before he turned away, he looked back at them one more time. Because I was married to a Cheyenne woman once, long time ago, before the wars, and when they made me choose between her and my badge, I chose the badge. His voice went hard with regret. Been living with that choice for 15 years? Don't see why you should have to make the same mistake. And with that, he and his men rode off into the darkness. Caleb and Maella stood on the porch long after the hoofbeats faded. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They both understood that they'd just been given borrowed time, days, maybe weeks, before the militia came back, before the tribe learned about the baby, before the world they were trying to keep at bay came crashing through their door. We should run, Maella finally said, while we have the chance. Caleb shook his head. No, I'm done running too. This is our land, our home, and we're staying. The next morning brought something unexpected. Hope. Maella woke to find her body changing in ways that confirmed the pregnancy. The morning sickness that had been plaguing her seemed to ease. Her appetite returned with a vengeance, and most importantly, she could feel the baby now. Not movement, not yet, but a presence, a life growing inside her that was half her, half Caleb, and entirely their choice. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, really smiled. Caleb was outside checking the perimeter when she found him. He'd been up all night, paranoid that the militia would come back despite Dalton's promise. But when he saw Maella walking toward him in the morning light, her hand resting on her stomach, her face glowing with something he couldn't quite name, all his exhaustion melted away. It's real, she said when she reached him. I can feel it. The baby. It's real. Caleb reached out tentatively and placed his hand over hers. Yeah, he said softly. It is. But the moment of peace shattered when they heard a sound from the tree line. Not horses this time. Footsteps. Multiple people on foot, moving through the brush with practiced stealth. Caleb's hand moved to his gun, but Maella grabbed his wrist. Wait, she whispered. Those aren't soldiers. Those are Apache. Her eyes went wide with terror. They're hunting. 5 figures emerged from the trees, all women, all armed with traditional weapons, bows, knives, spears, and leading them was someone Maella recognized immediately, Kiona, her childhood friend. The woman who'd stood silent while the tribe beat her, the woman who'd watched them throw her in the river and done nothing to stop it. Maella's hand tightened on Caleb's arm. "Kiona!" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "What do you want?" Kiona stepped forward, her face unreadable. "We heard rumors," she said in Apache, but Maella translated for Caleb in English. "That you survived, that you're living with a white man, that you're—" Her eyes dropped to Maella's stomach, and her expression hardened. "That you're carrying his child." Maella lifted her chin. "Yes, all of it is true." Kiona's face twisted with something that looked like pain. "How could you?" she hissed. "After everything we taught you, after all our traditions, you would betray the tribe like this?" "Betray?" Maella's voice rose. "I didn't betray anyone. You betrayed me, all of you, when you held me down and beat me for wanting to choose my own life. When you threw me in that river and watched me drown. That was betrayal." Kiona flinched like she'd been slapped. "We were following the law, the chief's law." Maella laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "And that makes it better? That you were just following orders when you tried to murder me?" The other 4 women shifted uncomfortably. One of them, younger than the others, spoke up. "We didn't know they were going to kill you. We thought it was just punishment." Miella turned her fierce gaze on the young woman. "And you think that makes it okay? That you didn't know they'd go that far? You still participated? You still held me down? You still watched them tie the ropes around my wrists so tight they cut to the bone?" Her voice broke. "I called out your names, all of you. I begged you to help me, and you turned your backs." Silence fell over the clearing. Then Kiona did something no one expected. She knelt. Right there in the dirt, she dropped to her knees, and tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I was a coward. We all were. And I've carried that shame every day since. When we heard you survived, when we heard about the baby." She looked up at Miella with desperate eyes. "Some of us want to make it right. Some of us want to help." Caleb, who'd been silent through all this, finally spoke. "How do we know this isn't a trap?" Kiona switched to heavily accented English. "Because if we wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. We've been watching your cabin for 3 days. We could have burned it down, could have shot you both, but we didn't." She stood up, wiping her eyes. "The tribe is split. Half want Maella dead for the shame she's brought. The other half think maybe she was right to run, that maybe our old ways are killing us." "Why are you here?" Maella asked, her voice trembling. Kiona met her eyes. "Because civil war is coming. The young warriors want revenge for the women who left. The elders want to preserve tradition at any cost. And in the middle of it all, there are people like us who don't know what to believe anymore. We need help. And we thought maybe you'd know where to start." Maella looked at Caleb, who looked just as confused as she felt. "You want my help?" Maella said slowly. "After everything your tribe did to me, you want me to come back and fix it?" Kiona shook her head. "Not come back, but maybe show us there's another way. That women can choose. That strength doesn't have to mean submission. That—" She broke off, struggling for words. "That we don't have to keep killing each other to feel powerful." It was insane. Absolutely insane. But as Maella stood there, feeling the baby move inside her for the first time, a tiny flutter that made her gasp, she realized something. She could spend the rest of her life hiding, running, fighting off militia and tribal warriors and anyone else who wanted to control her. Or she could do something crazy, something brave, something that might actually change things. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. Kiona's answer was simple and terrifying. "Come speak to the women, not the warriors, not the chiefs, the women. Tell them your story. Show them that you survived, that you're building something new, and maybe enough of them will listen that we can stop this war before it starts." Caleb immediately shook his head. No, absolutely not. You're asking her to walk right back into the hands of people who tried to kill her. But Miella put her hand on his arm. Caleb, she said softly, what if she's right? What if? Caleb's voice rose. Miella, they'll kill you the moment you set foot in that camp. But Miella's eyes were far away, seeing something he couldn't. Or what if seeing me alive, seeing me happy, seeing me choosing my own path? What if that's exactly what they need to see? What if I can save one woman from what I went through? Wouldn't that be worth the risk? The argument that followed was fierce. Caleb said it was suicide. Miella said it was necessary. Kiona and her group stood silently, watching this white man and Apache woman fight about whether she should risk her life to save people who'd tried to end it. Finally, Caleb played his last card. What about the baby? He said quietly. What about our child? You're willing to risk that? Miella placed both hands on her stomach. I'm doing this for the baby, she said, so it grows up in a world where mothers don't have to watch their daughters get beaten for wanting to choose who they love, where women don't have to be property, where strength means having the courage to change, not the stubbornness to stay the same. She looked at Caleb with tears in her eyes. I have to do this, not for them, for us. And that's how, 3 days later, Caleb Rowan found himself riding toward an Apache camp with his pregnant wife, who wasn't really his wife, and 5 Apache women who may or may not be leading them into a trap. He was armed to the teeth, had made Miella promise to stay close to him at all times, and had left detailed instructions with Sheriff Dalton about what to do if they didn't return. But none of that made him feel any better about riding into a camp full of people who wanted them dead. The camp came into view at sunset, and Caleb's stomach dropped. There were at least 200 people there, warriors with painted faces, elders sitting around fires, women preparing food, children playing. And when they saw Miella, when they recognized that towering figure riding at the front of the group, everything stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Children grabbed their mother's legs, warriors reached for weapons. The silence that fell was so complete, Caleb could hear his own heartbeat. Kiona rode forward, calling out in Apache. Caleb couldn't understand most of it, but Miella translated in whispers. She's telling them I'm here under protection, that I've come to speak to the women, that any man who tries to stop me will answer to her. Caleb looked at her sharply. Can she enforce that? Miella's face was pale. We're about to find out. A commotion near the center of the camp drew everyone's attention. A group of warriors was pushing through the crowd, and leading them was Dakota, the war chief who'd come to Caleb's ranch weeks before. His face was twisted with rage. How dare you! He roared, switching to English so Caleb would understand. How dare you bring this traitor back here? He leveled his spear at Miella. She was declared dead to us. She has no right to stand on tribal land. But before anyone could respond, something unexpected happened. Women started standing up. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. They rose from where they'd been sitting, set down what they were doing, and moved toward Miella. Not aggressively, just standing, witnessing, creating a wall of female bodies between the warriors and the woman they'd tried to kill. Dakota looked around in shock. What are you doing? He demanded. Sit down! This is not your concern! An older woman, her face lined with years but her eyes sharp as flint, stepped forward. Not our concern, she said, her voice carrying across the camp. A woman beaten and thrown in a river for refusing to be property, that is very much our concern. She looked at Miella. Speak, daughter. We are listening. And with those words, everything changed. Because suddenly, this wasn't about tribal law or white man's law or any law. This was about women who'd spent their whole lives being told what to do, finally asking, what if there's another way? Miella dismounted slowly, Caleb right beside her. She stood there, This massive woman with a white man's baby growing inside her, surrounded by hundreds of people who had every reason to hate her. And she spoke. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm not here to say your traditions are wrong or that you should abandon your ways. I'm here to tell you that I survived. They beat me until I could barely stand. They tied ropes around my wrists so tight they cut through flesh. They threw me in a freezing river and watched me sink. And I survived." She paused, letting those words sink in. "And you know what I found when I survived? I found a man who saw me as human, not property. I found a choice I'd never been given. I found the freedom to say yes or no without being killed for it. And now I'm carrying a child that I chose to create, with a man I chose to love, in a home I chose to make." She placed her hand on her stomach. "This baby will never know what it's like to be beaten for having a voice. And that's not because I rejected you. It's because I rejected being treated like I don't matter." The silence that followed was profound. Then women started crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears streaming down faces that had learned not to show emotion. Tears from mothers who'd watched their daughters forced into marriages they didn't want. From grandmothers who'd endured the same and thought it was just the way things were. From young women who'd been looking at their futures with dread. Maella's survival, her defiance, her choice, it cracked something open in that camp, something that had been locked tight for generations. But not everyone was moved. Dakota pushed through the crowd, his face purple with rage. "This is an abomination!" he shouted. "She carries the child of a white man! She has betrayed her blood, her people, everything we stand for!" He turned to the crowd. "Any woman who listens to her is a traitor. Any woman who follows her example will be cast out." But the old woman who'd spoken before stepped directly into his path. "Then cast us all out," she said calmly, "because I'm done watching my granddaughters live in fear." What happened next would be talked about in that tribe for generations. One by one, women started moving toward Miella. Not all of them. Maybe a third of the women in camp. But they moved. They stood beside her, creating a human wall between her and the warriors. And when Dakota raised his spear, when he actually moved to strike, it wasn't a man who stopped him. It was his own mother. She grabbed the spear and ripped it from his hands. "Enough," she said. And her voice held all the authority of someone who'd raised him, loved him, and was now deeply ashamed of what he'd become. "This ends now." The standoff could have gone either way, but then the chief himself emerged from his tent. Not Dakota, but the true chief, Cochis, the old man who'd exiled Miella weeks before. He surveyed the scene, his son with rage in his eyes, the women divided, and this massive Apache woman standing with a white man, pregnant with his child, defying everything their tribe represented. And then he did something no one expected. He laughed. "You always were stronger than all of us," he said to Miella in Apache. "We tried to break you, and instead you broke our tribe in half." Miella met his eyes without fear. "I didn't break anything. I just refused to be broken." Cochis nodded slowly. "And now we must decide what that means, whether we punish strength or honor it, whether we kill those who choose differently or learn from them." He looked at the divided camp, at the women standing together, at the men gripping weapons they didn't know whether to use. "I am old," he said, "and perhaps I have been holding too tightly to old ways. Perhaps it is time for new ways." Dakota exploded. "Father, you cannot be serious. She must be punished. They both must." But Cochis turned to his son with eyes full of sorrow. "And what would that punishment accomplish? Would it bring honor to our tribe? Would it make us stronger? Or would it just prove that we are so weak, so fragile, that we must kill anyone who dares to be different?" He shook his head. "No, my son. This ends today. Miella will leave in peace, and any woman who wishes to follow her example will not be harmed. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Half the warriors were furious, muttering about tradition and honor and betrayal. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A tiny opening that said maybe, just maybe, women could have choices. That maybe strength meant allowing freedom, not enforcing control. As Mayella and Caleb prepared to leave, Kiona approached them one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "You just changed everything." Mayella shook her head. "I just refused to die. You all did the rest." The ride back to Caleb's ranch was silent. They were both in shock, neither quite believing they'd survived. But as they crested the final hill and saw the cabin in the distance, Caleb reached over and took Mayella's hand. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand back. "I was terrified the entire time." He smiled. "That's what makes it brave." The weeks that followed felt like living in a dream. Mayella's pregnancy progressed steadily. Her belly grew round and firm. She felt the baby kick for the first time while hanging laundry, and the look of wonder on her face when she grabbed Caleb's hand and pressed it to her stomach made him cry. They prepared the cabin, building a small cradle, gathering supplies, planning for a future that had seemed impossible just months before. And slowly, word spread. About the woman who'd survived. About the tribe that had split because of her. About the white man who'd chosen love over safety. Other women started showing up. First one, a young Apache girl who'd run from a forced marriage. Then 2 more, then 5. Women from different tribes, different backgrounds, all looking for the same thing. The freedom to choose. Mayella and Caleb's small cabin became a way station, a place where women could catch their breath before continuing on to wherever they were heading. Caleb built additional shelters. Mayella taught the women survival skills. Together, they created something that had never existed before, a place where women's choices mattered. The baby came on a spring morning, born into a world that was still dangerous, still broken, but slowly, painfully learning to change. She was massive, of course she was, with Mayella as her mother, with black hair and dark eyes and lungs that could wake the dead. Caleb held his daughter for the first time and felt something inside him that had been frozen for 7 years, finally thaw. "What do we call her?" he asked. Mayella, exhausted but glowing, smiled. "Hope," she said. "We call her Hope." And that's where the story should end, with a man, a woman, and a baby building a life against impossible odds, with love winning over tradition, choice triumphing over control, and 2 broken people finding something whole in each other. But life is rarely that simple. Because 6 months after Hope was born, Sheriff Dalton rode up to the ranch with news that made Caleb's blood run cold. The territorial governor had learned about the Apache settlement on Caleb's land, and he was sending troops to clear it out. They had 3 days to disband, or everyone would be arrested, or worse. Caleb looked at Mayella, at Hope sleeping in her mother's arms, at the dozen women who'd found safety on their land, and he made a decision. "We don't run," he said. "Not anymore. We've run enough." Mayella's eyes went wide. "Caleb, they'll kill us. All of us." He nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe it's time to make them see that what we're doing here matters, that these women matter, that our daughter deserves to grow up in a world where this is possible." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Caleb sent word to everyone he knew, ranchers, traders, even some Apache allies from tribes that had split like Mayella's. He wrote letters to newspapers, describing what they were building and why it mattered. He appealed to politicians, to church leaders, to anyone who might listen. Most ignored him, but some didn't. And when the troops finally arrived, expecting to find a small ranch with a few refugees, they found something else. They found 200 people, ranchers who'd brought their families to stand with Caleb, Apache leaders from 3 different tribes who'd declared the land neutral territory, women from as far as California who'd heard about what Mayella had done and traveled weeks to be there. Even some soldiers refused to participate, throwing down their weapons rather than attack what one of them called the only decent thing I've seen on this God-forsaken frontier. The commanding officer stared at the crowd for a long moment, then turned his horse around and rode away. The governor could send all the orders he wanted, but he couldn't make an entire region turn against itself. And that's how a woman who'd been thrown in a river to die became the catalyst for something bigger than anyone could have predicted. How a man who'd spent 7 years waiting to die found a reason to live. How a baby named Hope grew up in a place where women could choose their own paths, where strength meant kindness, and where two people who should have been enemies built something beautiful instead. It wasn't perfect. There were still fights, still conflicts, still people who wanted to see them fail, but they survived, together. So if this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of choice, the courage it takes to stand against tradition, and the way one person's refusal to be broken can change the world, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button.